produced a kind of a very, very famous set of postcards about the Senghenydd disaster. The nation looked on in horror as the dead were brought up from the pit and families learned of the tragic fate of their loved ones. Those who were close to the disaster came to offer support, watch in solidarity with the families of the victims, or even just came to satisfy their own curiosity. Ivor Jones, later a Colliery official at Seven Sisters down in Port Talbot, for those who know Wales well, whose father went to help at the pit head and indeed took some of the funeral services after the disaster, was about 5 years old at the time of the explosion. So Jones's family went to offer their support, and he later remembered seeing bodies brought up and witnessed the emotional scenes at the pit head. As he later recalled, the women were crying, my own mother among them. Every woman was crying, and all of the ministers were all helping out. The dead were so many that a new cemetery had to be opened, and thousands flocked to the valley to attend the funerals of the men. So fast forwarding to another horrific Welsh mining disaster in 1934, the Gresford mining disaster killed 262 men and boys, with 3 rescue workers and a surface worker also perishing, bringing the total to 266. The bodies of only 12 of them were ever recovered from the mine, and the rest remained entombed. So as the chief inspector of the mines, Henry Walker, explained to a bereaved family, I'm not going to get any of the bodies. I'd rather let it be their grave. Now, this decision to not rescue bodies from the Gresford pit was, quite understandably, highly unpopular among the families of the men who were entombed. Some of the Gresford widows lobbied figures in positions of authority to aid them in their request to bring up the bodies. They dogged conferences set up to discuss the remains, in which the bereaved had no official say, demanding news and making their own views well known. Ultimately, this had no effect, and the men remained entombed within the pit. It was indeed their grave. So after both disasters, there was an outpouring of charitable giving by a concerned public. People wanted to show their sympathy through practical means and collectively donated thousands of pounds to help both the bereaved families and those who were out of work because of the explosions. Now, while the focus of this talk is how the money was collected, over the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about how it was kind of administered once it had all been consolidated into a large fund, so you sort of have some idea of the end game and of how these funds were kind of eventually used. So disaster funds raised by public subscription were generally siphoned into a central fund and administered by a committee comprised of people with some local importance or experience of being involved in local government. Generally, grants were paid in weekly instalments to an injured man or the family of the deceased. And both the Senghenydd and Gresford funds were eventually centralised and administered through the locality in which the disaster occurred. So, you know, Senghenydd in the south and Gresford, Rexford up in the north. Now, this was not necessarily a straightforward process. After the Gresford disaster, the charitable relief funds were consolidated into 2 major funds, the Lord Lieutenant of Denbighshire's and the Lord Mayor of London's, which were then consolidated into 1 major fund in 1935. And the confused kind of notion, the confusion surrounding these funds is something that we're going to pick up on in a second, because it's quite important when we start to think about where urban district council relief funds fit in to this kind of milieu of funds after disaster. So despite public generosity, families who received such charity were worse off than if their main breadwinner had lived. This was a result of a deliberate policy of impoverishment by the administrators of both charity and state funds. The administrators of the Gresford Fund were particularly vocal in claiming that the families of the deceased were not to be in an advantageous financial position, and that the death of their loved one would not be met with a sudden windfall. If Gresford widows remarried, they voided their claim to the fund, as it was assumed that their new husband could be relied on for financial aid. And as Catherine Welsby has shown in her work, there were strict moral conditions attached to the funds. So in her work on the 1913 Senghenydd disaster fund, she highlighted how difficult it could be for women to access the money. So they had to provide marriage certificates and birth certificates, which they didn't necessarily have, and to avoid all immoral acts loosely defined. Otherwise, again, their right to claiming from the fund would be void. So the families of those who died in industrial accidents were financially reliant on a mixture of state funds and private charity. And for the victims of disaster, charitable funds constituted at least half of the income that they could hope to receive in the weeks and months following the tragedy. Of course, what I'm talking about today is not how these funds were centrally controlled and doled out, which is the focus of scholarly literature on the subject. Instead, here we're exploring how small relief funds, which emerged in the aftermath of disaster, were created and how they collected money to send into these big central funds. So as you can kind of see from the slide, there were a substantial number of different groups raising money after a disaster. Nationally, there was only one final fund for each disaster. But locally, there were thousands of different kind of types of fund competing for people's money up and down the country. By looking at local funds, we shift attention away from the area the charity was administered in, so that would be kind of the final consolidated fund, and instead outwards to the various groups across the nation who were all funneling money into one locale. It allows us to think about how districts unaffected by disaster reacted to it and the steps that they took to aid people in need. So as you can see, in terms of sheer numbers, the most prolific groups were small local ones. Churches, members' clubs, and a whole range of other associational groups. However, these were competing with larger local funds, most often run by local newspapers. Often the very small local groups would give the funds they had raised to these larger local collections, and these collections in turn were subsumed into the large national collections, which were eventually all consolidated into the final fund. As Lynn Kiesling has shown in her work about the Lancashire cotton famine, locally based private charities, public relief funds, and national charities coordinated their activities in order to provide relief for those in need. And at a macro level, this was ostensibly the case in the 20th century with the Barry Urban District Council relief funds. They were part of a kind of wide variety of charitable endeavours which collectively raised vast sums for those in need. Yet within Barry, there were tensions which pressured this small fund run by local government. And although urban district councils did not usually fundraise, disaster could compel them to join in and enter into this milieu of competing funds. Despite the positive reaction from Barry residents, the nature of the Urban District Council relief funds meant that they faced severe competition for charitable giving from both smaller, more localised collections and from larger funds in nearby towns and cities, and especially in Barry's case, they were often in direct competition with Cardiff, which is only a few miles away. So the Barry Urban District Council Relief Fund committees use simple fundraising methods to ensure a variety of people with a wide variety of financial means had the opportunity to donate. Both the 1913 and the 1934 committee decided that house-to-house collection and a fundraising concert would be the primary means of fundraising in Barry, with committees established to organise the two different activities. And the composition of the Barry Urban District Council Relief Fund committees was similar to that of a voluntary body in the early 20th century. The majority of the committee members were men, with a smattering of women to help organise the collections and make everything run smoothly. Now, the two disasters occurred at the height of Barry's financial success and within the depths of the economic depression which gripped the industry-heavy South Wales. In 1933, approximately 40% of the workforce in Barry were unemployed, and those who were in employment faced abnormally low wages. Yet this did very little to impede the charitably minded residents of the town. Nationally, the Depression did little to stifle the philanthropic tendency among members of the public, with public donations to charities substantially increasing during the interwar years, even during the Depression. And despite the hardship that Barry's residents faced, their philanthropic tendencies were largely in line with national efforts. And the effects of the Depression were only mentioned once in 1934 in a committee circular sent to those who had aided the house-to-house collection. which simply noted that, and I quote, "Considering present economic conditions, the sum collected has been most gratifying." So the house-to-house collections were popular, with the 1913 collection raising about £83, rising to around about £136 in 1934. However, despite the popularity of the house-to-house collections, it was the variety of performances that were key to both fundraising campaigns. The concerts featured local acts and were widely advertised. Tickets were sold at various prices to ensure that people from different socio-economic backgrounds could support the fund and enjoy the entertainment on offer. This strategy was clearly successful, with the residents of Barry raising a total of around about £500 in 1913 and over £600 in 1934. The 1913 fund was directly siphoned into the centralised Senghenydd fund, run by local authorities in the valleys, and proceeds from the 1934 fund were sent to the Western Mail, which was in turn subsumed into the larger Wrexham fund. But the Barry Urban District Council encountered some difficulties when trying to. Charitable fundraising was not one of their usual duties, and in the case of Barry, these two funds mark the only real attempt that the Urban District Council had at interloping into a space usually devoid of government interference. The creation of the Urban District Council funds were an intervention into what had previously been the locus of civic society. It's been well established that by the early 20th century, the boundary between state and civic society was decidedly porous. The intermingling of state-imposed assistance for families of disaster through the Workmen Compensations Act with that of private charity from disaster funds is representative of the wider mixed economy of welfare present in the interwar period. And in practice, this mixed economy often of the state and of the voluntary sector was often enacted at a local level. So during the interwar period, charities and local governments worked in tandem to deliver child protection services and educational initiatives. And increasingly, the two relied on each other for the long-term social care. However, the Barry funds were not an example of local government working with charities to provide a local service. Instead, the Urban District Council explicitly raised money and organised volunteers for a specific event outside of their locality. And as such, they broke this kind of pre-assumed role that local government works with local charities to provide for long-term local care. And instead they take on a civic role and intervened in public life in a new way. And in part, because this was such an unprecedented role for them, the people of Barry in some ways seem to struggle to quite work out where the funds fit within the kind of wider hierarchy of charitable funds. So the Barry Urban District Council was stuck, really, between much smaller funds run by church groups and societies and larger funds run by local newspapers. One local group who sold concert tickets for the relief fund were forced to postpone their own concert, writing that, and I quote, "Due to the series of concerts and entertainments which have already been held in the town, it was felt that the time was most inappropriate to secure good patronage." This in and of itself wasn't an unusual complaint. Donor fatigue was an emotion felt elsewhere and after other disasters, such as after the West Stanley disaster in 1909, where we get newspaper reports of poor turnouts at whist drives because there had been too many entertainment options. And while the oversaturation of the entertainment market for charitable causes was a fundraising hazard, here we can actively see the Barry Urban District Council Fund directly stopping other groups holding their own variety events, which did kind of cause some grumbling, really, among volunteers. But it was resistance from business that really shows that, in many ways, the Barry Urban District Council Fund couldn't really compete with larger local funds. So both the 1913 and the 1934 committees sent circulars to businesses asking them for donations to the fund. However, the 1913 fund in particular was met with a lukewarm response. Local businesses were expected to donate something when asked. Barry Doyle's work has shown that local businessmen in Norwich accused their peers of insufficient involvement in philanthropic activity after a flood in 1912. You know, businesses did, on the whole, donate some money to relief funds and were expected to, but in this instance, they didn't necessarily donate them to the Barry Urban District Council Relief Fund. While some companies gave the Barry Urban District Council a small amount, others were somewhat reluctant. The chairman of the ship store merchants Fraser and Company, who had their stores in Barry, sent a letter which simply read, "Anything I do at present, unless I change my mind, I intend to do at Cardiff." Now, I suspect that many businesses simply didn't donate to the Barry Fund as they didn't expect it was going to happen. Only fundraising for two disasters 20 years apart does not set the kind of precedent that one needs to ensure that businesses know to donate to your fund instead of other larger local ones, such as the Lord Mayor of Cardiff's fund or the newspaper-based Western Mail collection. Nonetheless, these outright refusals do place the Barry Urban District Council relief funds in a kind of strange hinterland between small and large collections. They're larger than the small collections, but they're not quite allowed to be in the same space as these other large local funding collections. But although the Barry Urban District Council struggled to find its place amongst fundraisers, it did know how to use civic spaces and the functions of civic society to consolidate its role in the locality. Many of the ways that urban district councils fundraised relied on the goodwill of local volunteers. So the charitable nature of the funds, with roots in ideas of voluntarism and civic society, naturally meant that the Urban District Council called upon volunteers to help manage the house-to-house collections and to be involved with the variety shows. In 1913, the Boy Scouts were all asked to deliver envelopes to be filled with cash alongside a leaflet explaining the reason for the collection, which you can see on the slides. By 1934, instead of the Boy Scouts distributing the packets, various volunteers distributed leaflets in their districts and collected them again 5 days before the fundraising concert was held with any donations. The volunteers were organised by the councillors of the wards that the collections took place in. Many of the volunteers for the house-to-house collection in 1934 were women, but among the men there were 3 vicars and a councillor, hinting at the type of middle-class, civic-minded volunteer the councillor of the ward was likely to encounter. While the Urban District Council funds were crossing into this unknown charitable fundraising territory, they nonetheless knew who to approach to make their funds appealing. But why did they decide to step into this philanthropic sphere at all? So the reasons for creating the funds can be traced within broader local government trends of the 1930s. In Britain, by the 1930s, local governments oversaw a rich array of local services, which were subsumed into central powers following the Second World War. Nationally, as their powers were rescinding, local governments consolidated their control over civic space. Although compared to other urban district councils in the 1930s, urban district councils in South Wales showed a remarkable amount of autonomy, they still showed signs of this wider trend to mark their local territory. Barry, as a town established in the late 19th century, married a clear sense of localism with the urgency of creating a strong identity as an area formed by the South Wales coalfield, but not of it. The Barry Urban District Council relief funds played on conceptions of localism and, through fundraising initiatives, expressed a strong sense of regional and urban identity, shifting from an appeal to the county in 1913 to civic duty towards the town in 1934. So while the genesis of the 1913 Barry Urban District Council Disaster Fund is unknown, although it's likely to have been a mixture of local pressure and the interests of the council, by the 1930s, it was externally expected that town representatives would establish a collection for those in need. In 1934, the Barry Urban District Council received a circular from the Gresford Colliery Disaster Relief Fund. So this is the centralised fund run through Wrexham that would eventually be the main administrative fund. And in their letter, they said, and I quote, "Although we find from newspaper reports that a large number of borough, urban and rural councils in the country have taken action in organising appeals and collections for the benefit of the fund, we venture to address this letter to all authorities requesting cooperation in making the fund as large as possible. The need for a substantial fund is very great. and we trust that we may appeal to your council to organise collections in your area. This call for assistance through local government powers is indicative of the perceived local influence and organisational strength of the urban district councils in the mid-1930s. Married with this shaming tactic, in noting that many had already independently decided to establish a relief fund, reluctant urban district councils were spurred into action. And this was reflected in national newspapers. So again, by the 1930s, the Times is mentioning donations to National Mansion House funds, in this case from Weston-super-Mare, from Slough, and from Enfield, I think is somewhere in this clip. Now this marks a considerable change from 1913, when only individual business and newspaper donations to the national funds were published in the press, not those by local authorities. In 1913, it seems that it was the norm for urban district councils to donate their fund to a larger one without seeking national recognition, although of course this would be locally recognised. But by 1934, urban district council relief funds were being recognised as independent contributors in their own right, which again fits into this narrative of increasing control and of UDCs trying to assert their own relevance, really, on a national stage. In Barry, calls for the establishment of a local fund were not just coming from other local authorities, but from groups inside the town. The Barry and District Trade Union Council asked the Urban District Council to help establish a local fund. They offered their experience, having organised a collection for Lancashire cotton workers, saying that they were, and I quote, prepared to place at your disposal the assistance of the trade union machinery, concluding there will be no lack of willing voluntary helpers. So internal pressure from the residents and trade unions, along with external pressure from the Gresford Fund and the newspaper lists of urban district councils, spurred the Barry UDC into action. And it called for a meeting to discuss the possibility of opening a fund in early October 1934, nearly 2 weeks after the disaster, which is really quite slow compared to a lot of other local funds. So when inviting representatives to the meeting, the council seemed unsure as to whether it would actually even open a relief fund or not. This hesitancy of the Barry Urban District Council to organise a fund without support from local groups suggests that the committee was aware of the difficulties of establishing a fund in Barry, especially given some of the feedback that they got 20 years previously. Given the amount of fundraising already occurring as well, and the lateness of this meeting compared to other more reactionary fundraising activities, I think really does signal a reluctance to get involved in some ways. In 1913, the organisation of the fund was left to committee members only, seemingly without external consultation with the residents of Barry. By 1934, however, the Urban District Council presented itself as an organisation comfortable in its own urban space, willing to extend its reach to others as an organisational facilitator at a time of need. So in 1934, the Barry Urban District Council ensured that various groups within the town, as well as the town's urban spaces, were involved in their activities. So the initial meeting for the 1934 committee was held in the public library, for example, which had been opened in 1906 as part of the council's attempts to turn Barry into a thriving town. And at the suggestion of the Trades Unions Council, the meeting was open to all religious, social and political organisations in Barry, and letters were sent to ensure that representatives were in attendance. And this consideration for the local area and for local support is also continued when looking at things like the printed ephemera that was commissioned for the variety concerts. So the 1913 and the 1934 Urban District Councils ensured that fundraising concerts were well advertised. In 1913, commissioning ephemera to kind of show this, to advertise this, was a bit of a slapdash affair. In 1934, extreme care was taken to ensure that all printers in Barry produced some kind of promotional material. The 1934 committee formed a subcommittee, so I think we're a subcommittee by this point, to deal with all matters of advertising and publicity in connection with the entertainment. And the 1934 committee, far more so than their 1913 counterparts, showed a commitment to equally spreading printing contracts throughout Barry firms, showing a high level of care not to indicate favouritism and ensuring that, again, all were satisfied with Urban District Council spending on local services. This is very wholesome and inclusive. Now, the Urban District Council had no slush fund to pay for this advertising material from, and so it was paid for by money raised for the disaster fund. A portion of it was taken out to pay for the ephemera. The lack of central funds to pay for the bills and ephemera are indicative of the limits of the Urban District Council and suggest perhaps why they needed to fundraise as intensively as they did within the local area. The letter from the Gresford Relief Fund calling for help highlighted that a number of local authorities had already pledged assistance and were simply waiting for permission from the Ministry of Health to use their municipal funds to aid others. The use of local funds for the relief of others was present after other disasters. So Richard Rogers' work on the Edinburgh Town Council's Common Good Fund shows that they donated a portion of it to external disaster funds to encourage city residents to do the same. Now, by the 1930s, urban district councils had little direct authority over unusual financial expenditure, which this would have been perceived as, and so were forced to appeal to the state to use funds in an unorthodox way. So instead of asking for existent funds to be used to aid a different local authority, as some others did, the Barry Urban District Council decided to use a proportion of the disaster funds they had raised to pay for advertisement instead. While urban district councils were gaining national recognition through newspaper notices of their fundraising efforts, they were hampered by the increasingly restricted powers afforded to them in the interwar period. Although this has been a micro-study of just one urban district council, seeing the Barry responses to disaster offers a useful insight into both how relief funds operated within civic spaces, but also how urban district councils tried to adapt, really, to the unusual circumstances presented to them. So to briefly conclude, urban district council relief funds were highly popular as a philanthropic response to disaster. They allowed the town to unify through a common goal, express solidarity with those in need, and provided a means through which the council could express its civic pride. The funds were a direct interjection into what had previously been the realm of charity. And when the disaster fund had been completed, the Barry Urban District Council withdrew itself from the area of civic society which it had invaded. This careful manoeuvring through the kind of porous line between local government and civic society suggests that the Urban District Council was only able to overstep this unspoken and highly blurred boundary line at times of perceived need. And I'm going to leave you with a set of questions which have sprung up while I've been revising this topic for this talk today. So by the 1930s, it seems that a substantial number of urban district councils rallied at a time of crisis, joining in with this almost competitive. Did they encounter the same problems of being stuck between large and small funds, or were these problems specific to Barry? More broadly, what can an examination of national approaches to disaster collecting tell us about urban district councils on a national stage? So I've suggested that Barry fits in with wider trends, but is this true across the board? And what else can a close examination of multiple urban district councils tell us about broader attitudes to disaster relief? In 1934, we see one council reaching out to others for aid, but when were these charitable networks between urban district councils created, and how often were they called on at times of extreme need? These studies have huge implications for understanding how local government tried to aid people, not of its locale at times of crisis. So what can this tell us about how the local becomes national and then contracts again? And maybe what can this reveal about the different spaces and layers that urban district councils occupied? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.